neighbor was a whaleman, shipwrecked far from home. He dreamed of...
Hi gang, remember me? The guy with the Whaleboat series? Bet you thought I wasn't coming back after a while. Well, I am back, and I apologize for the long delay, but we're going to get started with a new episode, and we're going to get right into it. This is episode 8 on building the whaleboat. You remember the whaleboat, even if you don't remember me. And here's where we are to this point. Looks a little different from the last time you saw it a year ago, but we're going to get the boat to this point in this episode. We've got a lot of ground to cover. Let's get started. I'm sure you've all heard the cliche, the devil is in the details. If that's true, the whaleboat has to be Satan's ride of choice. A casual look at the boat, you might think, a simple open boat with a graceful sheer and clean lines. Might be fun to make a quick model of it. But as soon as you get close enough to start noticing things, you realize that you're actually looking at a highly specialized tool for carrying out a very specific and dangerous job. And the form of the boat has evolved over the centuries, and this iteration is just about the pinnacle of that form. The components I'll be focusing on are the prime examples of that evolution and functional consideration. And we'll start with the thwarts. A thwart is just a simple place to sit in the boat. In a fishing dory like this one, it's literally just a plank that rests on the riser. If needed, there are notches cut into the ends that allow it to slip past the frames. It's not fixed in any way to the boat. In fact, when the dorymen aren't out fishing, they remove the thwarts so the boat can be nested one inside the other like you see in this photograph. But that's not so for our whaleboat. There are 5 thwarts, and no 2 are alike. There are similarities, but they're not identical, and all have more details to them than I like to think about. And nevertheless, those details have to go in. Now, in this photo, you can see 4 of the 5 thwarts. You can't see the 5th one because I'm sitting in it. It's actually the first one. And the basic method of construction. I'll try and spend just a couple of minutes outlining the differences and the similarities, and then we'll start making some dust. I promise. Now, in the actual boat, 4 of the thwarts are 7 3/4 inches wide, and 1 is 8 inches wide. For this, I don't have a good explanation. I can't imagine that a 1/4 of an inch would make a difference, any kind of critical difference to anything in this boat. And yet, there it is. Do I bother making one plank 8/1000ths of an inch wider than the other 4? No, I don't. But whether or not you do is your choice. And my advice is, if you do make them all the same, make them all the 7 3/4 inch width. It gives you just a little bit more wiggle room should you need it. And we'll start with the first thwart, or the harpooner's oar or position. It's made up of the main plank, which runs the interior width of the boat, and then there is a 1x1 timber running down the center for its entire length. The ends are bent up into roughly a 6-inch radius, and that's done via saw kerfs on the back side. Then 1-inch fillers are fitted behind these. Now you'll notice I'm not bending that 1x1 into the radius. I just run the piece right up to the ends of the plank, and the radius pieces I'll make later, and you'll see me glue them in place. On each side of that 1x1 timber are the filler pieces that make the actual seating area for that thwart. When those are done, everything gets glued to the riser and then through bolted into the rails, the wales, and the rubbing strakes. And you can see that here in page 45 of Willett Ansell's book on building whaleboats in Mystic Seaport. Now, to make the thwarts, I sized the raw stock, and I've opted to make all 5 thwarts the same width. In this case, that's 1 inch by 7 3/4 inches, or at scale, it'll be 32 thousandths by 242 thousandths. And I give the stock a back bevel when I cut it so that when I flip it over and put it inside the boat, it'll snug up to the interior of the whales. And a bit of trying and fitting is always needed. And when it fits well, then I move on. Next comes that piece of 1x1. And that gets glued into place. Nothing special. For this first thwart, it runs the entire length of the thwart. Now the eagle-eyed among you will notice that that 1x1 just took a decided bend off to the aft edge of the thwart. I'll take care of that in a minute. Not the end of the world. Now the fillers that form the actual seating area of the thwart come next, and I usually leave this stock oversized and then trim it down to length and width after most of the fitting is done. But I always do try and remember to have one square end and one square edge for this. Now, even though you see me rough cutting it with the stock with just a knife, it's always the square edge that gets butted up to the 1x1 and the square end facing the inboard side of the thwart. Now, using a nice, sharp, new number 11 blade, you see me here trying to slice off a finger. That didn't work. So next I tried a chisel. But that didn't work either. But I did manage to trim off that errant piece of 1x1 and slice some of the excess away from the fillers, however clumsy the attempt. In my defense, I have to say that for some reason that chisel got really dull. But I took the hint, stopped, took 5 minutes, put a new edge on it. And finally, I glued that piece of 1x1 stock to replace what I cut off earlier. Put it in much straighter this time. I managed to get that done. Now that 1x1 timber was actually not 32 thousandths square as it should have been. It was actually 32 thousandths by 42 thousandths. So I just glued the taller dimension standing up and then shaved everything down nice and flush with a couple of passes of a small hand plane and a little bit of sanding with an emery board. I think this would be a good spot for a sidebar about stock prep. Now, if your goal in building a model is to create a compelling impression of the actual vessel, it becomes very important to eliminate any elements that can distract your viewer from that impression. We have to work very hard to keep our viewers in that fragile bubble of willing suspension of disbelief. And bad or incomplete stock preparation is one very sure way to burst that bubble quickly. Master ship model builder Rob Napier refers to this as the hand of man. And that's any evidence that the piece has been worked. It could be saw marks left by a table saw. Or it could be furry wood fibers left on the underside of a saw cut. Maybe it's file marks left on a piece of brass. And there are others too, but you get the idea. All things you really need to watch out for. On my bench, I always keep a couple of pieces of glass to which I've glued fine grit sandpaper. And just a few passes on each surface of the stock is usually enough to eliminate anything that might take your viewer out of that illusion you are trying so hard to create. And if you're anything like me, and God, for your sake, I hope not, you just have to try and remember to actually use it. An indispensable tool for accomplishing this is a digital camera. Now, I'm not talking about some hotshot pro DSLR that can see atoms, like you see with this gear hound. But if you have a cell phone, you've really got the keys to the highway. Cell phone cameras are so good these days, they can do the job of that monstrous thing that you see there. If you're not quite sure that you've cleaned something up enough, take a picture of it with your phone and pinch zoom in. If it looks good at twice its actual size, you're good to go. Now let's get back to the boat. Now, the fillers and fillets are an annoying little detail, but they have to go in. Now, over the years, I've tried a bunch of different methods for making them, and I seem to have settled on this way that I'm about to show you here. Now, most of the seat components are 1-inch thick pine, so that makes everything at this scale 1/32 of an inch. Nice and easy. To make the fillets and fillers, I start with a piece of 1/32 inch aircraft plywood. This is the stuff that hobby shops sell for the RC airplane guys. I need it for the strength of that cross-grain construction. As you'll see in a moment, I'm going to expose this rather weeny piece of wood to some rather rough treatment. Because of the grain orientation, solid wood will almost never stand up to being treated that way. So it's better to eliminate any potential source of frustration right at the beginning. And here I start with a piece of that stock that I've cut about 1/8 inch wide on the saw. And with a sharp chisel, you see I've put a slight bevel in it, hoping to match the bevel on the thwart. And next I mark it to the height of the underside of the rail, and then I put another mark, roughly 1/4 of an inch up from that, just to give me some room. I'm going to use that clearance later on to file everything down a lot neater and more precisely. But this gets you started. And then with an emery wheel, I take away most of that rough cutting, and then I can put it in the vise and I can square and clean up everything up. I can square up the corners, I can put in the proper bevel, and I can get it down to the size I need it so that when I put it on the boat, it will fit as tightly as I can get it. It doesn't always come out perfect, but sometimes even a blind squirrel finds a nut. There's one now. And it doesn't take as long as you might think. Forming the actual fillet is next. And I do this with a couple of sanding and grinding bits in the Dremel. And like forming the clearance on the back side, the curve of the fillet is done by eye and muscle memory, which is quickly acquired through repetition. Now, off camera, I cut the fillet free from the stick and gave it a quick buffing with an abrasive wheel, and then I glue it in place. Now, the top of the fillet is always left long until the glue dries. And after it has set, a quick sanding with a sanding disc on a flexible shaft tool down to the level of the rail, and you're done. Now, the shape of these parts on the actual boats varies a lot. Now, you're going to be looking at two examples. These two whaleboats have been built recently, and then there's an older one you'll see. And the shape of the fillets and fillers varies greatly. So my advice, where this is concerned, is just settle on something that looks practical and to scale, and make them as consistent as possible. There are plenty of photos of whaleboat interiors for you to consult. Just pick one, stick to it. So now that you've seen me build one thwart, all the others are built along the same lines. even though, as I mentioned earlier, they all differ one from the other. There are two that have seat fillers running their entire length of the thwart. And even though they look similar here, by the next episode you'll see they will look very different from each other. 3 only have fillers for about 1/3 their length, and those fillers alternate from port to starboard. Now, because of their positions in the boat and the jobs they have to do, they all have specific details special to them. And all those details deserve to be included. So if you're actually building this model along with me, study the plans carefully. Now, you're probably wondering how I can say these small details all deserve to be included, and yet 5 minutes ago, you also heard me say I didn't bother to make one plank larger than the other 4. Well, I'd give you 2 reasons for that. One pragmatic and the other aesthetic. The pragmatic. At this scale, the difference between the sizes of the thwarts is 0.08 of an inch. That's less than 3 sheets of copy paper. Honestly, if this photo were not marked, would you be able to tell me which plank is smaller? No visual inspection would ever detect that small a difference. You'd need a pair of calipers to know that anything wasn't just as it appears. Additionally, my scale fidelity mantra is and always will be, if you have the choice of being oversized or undersized, go with the undersized every time. You will never be sorry you did. And the aesthetic reason? Quite frankly, it's my model. I build it according to the choices I deem most relevant to the purpose the model has to serve. If it doesn't outwardly impact the visual or the historical effect of the model, then it's up to my artistic interpretation to include, exclude, or just infer that particular detail. And quite frankly, the only reason anyone knows there is a difference is because I mentioned it here. And I'm going to make the bold assumption my secret is safe with you guys. So, having said all that, if I were working in a larger scale, like say 1:16 or certainly 1:12, I would have made the thwarts their actual different sizes, because at that scale it would have been noticeable. So it's a matter of keeping a perspective on things. And I think that this might be a good place to bring this episode to a close. I did hope to go further along, but a trip to Nerd Town always takes longer than you think it's going to. And speaking of expecting things, here's what you can expect in episode 9, which is already in the works, so you won't have to wait long. We'll take a look at making cleats. There are a few different types of cleats and sizes in this whaleboat. None are very hard to make, but like everything else on this model, they all have their differences. We'll also look at oarlock pads, and should there be time, we'll start dealing with the forward end of the boat, the thigh board, the warp box, and the bow chocks. So, thanks for watching, and keep an eye out for the next installment. It'll come up quick. Now, break's over. Get back in the shop.